Find South America on a map. Now find Polynesia. Look at the distance between them. That is 4,000 miles of open ocean with nothing in between. No islands. No landmarks. No way to know if land exists on the other side. Now ask yourself, who would attempt that crossing? And how do we know someone did it thousands of years before any European sailor dared to try? The answer is sitting in a genetics database in France, and it changes everything. We have spent centuries telling the story of human exploration as if it moved in one direction, west to east, old world to new world. European ships carrying European flags to shores that had, supposedly, never been touched by outside contact. That story is clean. It is easy to teach. It fits neatly onto a map with dotted lines and dates, and it is incomplete in a way that should make every history teacher in the world stop and reconsider what they've been saying. Because 1,200 years before Columbus set sail, someone crossed the largest ocean on Earth, in a hand-built canoe, with no instruments, no maps, no written record of what lay ahead. And we know it happened not because they left a monument or a document. We know it because their DNA is still alive in the bodies of people living today. Let's start with who these people actually were. The Polynesians are arguably the greatest navigators in the history of the human species. Between roughly 1000 BC and 1200 AD, they settled an area of the Pacific Ocean covering 10 million square miles. Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga. Hundreds of islands scattered across an ocean so vast it covers more than a third of the entire planet. They found every single one of them on purpose. No accidents. No lucky drifts. They read the stars. They read the swells. They felt the temperature of the water beneath their hulls. They watched the behavior of birds hundreds of miles from land. These were not primitive people stumbling across islands by chance. These were the most sophisticated ocean navigators who have ever lived. And the question that historians and scientists kept circling back to was this: how far east did they actually go? Easter Island sits at the very eastern tip of the Polynesian Triangle. It is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. The nearest continental landmass is the coast of Chile, roughly 2,300 miles away. For decades, researchers suspected that Polynesian voyagers had made it that far, and perhaps further. There were clues. The sweet potato, a plant native to South America, had been cultivated in Polynesia for centuries before any European contact. The Polynesian word for it, kamara, or a striking resemblance to the Quechua word for the same plant used by indigenous Andean peoples. Chicken bones found at a pre-Columbian archaeological site in Chile showed signs of Polynesian genetic ancestry. But clues are not proof. Clues can be argued away. Coincidence, drift, alternative explanations. DNA is not a clue. DNA is a fact. In 2020, geneticist Alexander Ioannidis and a team at Stanford University published a study that the scientific community had been building toward for years. They analyzed genome-wide data from over 800 individuals, 17 Polynesian island populations and 15 indigenous South American groups. What they were looking for was admixture, evidence that two previously separated populations had met, interbred, and left a detectable genetic signature in their descendants. They found it, clearly, consistently, across every Polynesian population they tested. The signal was not noise. It was not ambiguous. Every group carried a distinct and measurable proportion of South American indigenous DNA, and the timing of the admixture, calculated through the patterns of how DNA segments break down across generations, pointed to a single contact event. One meeting, sometime between 1150 and 1230 AD, 800 years before the study was published, 700 years before any European sailor reached the Pacific coast of South America. Think about what that means. Somewhere in the South Pacific, roughly 800 years ago, two groups of human beings who had developed entirely separately on opposite sides of the largest ocean on Earth met each other. We don't know where exactly. We don't know whether Polynesians reached South America or South Americans reached Polynesia. We don't know how many canoes were involved, how long the voyage took, how many people survived it, or what they said to each other when they finally touched shore. We know only that it happened, because their children's children's children are still alive, and their DNA remembers. But here's what's fascinating. The direction of that voyage is still one of the most contested questions in the field. The natural assumption is that Polynesians sailed east, consistent with their documented pattern of expansion across the Pacific, and the majority of researchers lean that way. But a competing hypothesis argues that the contact originated from the South American side. That indigenous peoples from the coast of what is now Colombia or Ecuador built their own ocean-going vessels, launched them into the open Pacific, and somehow found Polynesia. An ocean crossing of over 4,000 miles with no prior knowledge of what lay ahead. This is not a fringe theory. Thor Heyerdahl sailed a balsa wood raft called the Kon-Tiki from Peru to Polynesia in 1947 specifically to demonstrate that the crossing was physically possible from the American side. He made it. The voyage took 101 days. He was mocked by the scientific establishment for decades. The 2020 DNA study did not vindicate his specific theory. The genetics point to Polynesian ancestry as the dominant signal in the admixture, but it confirmed that the contact he was arguing for was real. And here's the part nobody talks about. This was not the only time the official timeline of pre-Columbian isolation had been quietly broken open. In 2013, a separate genetic study found traces of ancient Australasian DNA markers related to indigenous Australians and Papuans, buried in the genomes of certain Amazonian tribes in Brazil. People living in the interior of South America, thousands of miles from any ocean coast, were carrying DNA from populations that existed on the other side of the Pacific. Researchers named it the population Y signal. They still cannot fully explain how it got there. The leading theory involves a coastal migration along the Pacific rim of the Americas, tens of thousands of years ago. But the details remain unresolved. What is not unresolved is the fact of it. Something happened, something that doesn't fit the clean timeline. The oceans were not barriers. They never were. They were highways, and the people who lived before written history were using them in ways we are only now beginning to understand. But none of that captures the human reality of what the 2020 study actually found. Somewhere around 1200 AD, a group of people, we don't know how many, got into a canoe and pointed it toward the horizon. They had no guarantee that anything was out there. The Pacific at that latitude is not forgiving. Storms appear without warning. Fresh water runs out. The sun burns. The nights are cold. And the ocean in every direction looks exactly the same. To keep going requires a kind of courage that is almost impossible to conceptualize from the comfort of the modern world. They kept going. And when they finally reached the other side, whether that side was a Polynesian island or a South American coast, they met people. Real people. People with their own languages and their own histories and their own understanding of the world. And something happened between them. Something permanent enough to leave a mark in the genetic code of every descendant born from that meeting for the next 800 years. We will never know their names. We will never know what they called the ocean they crossed or the land they found. We will never know whether they went home or stayed or whether anyone back home ever learned what they had done. What we know is that they did it, and that for centuries, the story of human exploration was written in a way that made them invisible. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because nobody thought to look for it in the right place. The history of the world is full of people like that. People who did extraordinary things that the record forgot to mention. People whose proof of existence is not in any document or monument but in something far older and far more honest than either. Their blood is still out there, still being passed down, still carrying the memory of a crossing that nobody wrote down and almost nobody remembers. The ocean kept the secret for 800 years. The DNA gave it back.